Buenos días de nuevo.
Good morning again and welcome to this doctoral seminar, Modernization and Governance of the European Projects in a Plural Framework with Shared Values and Objectives, in which we will have in these 3 days interventions and presentations of the works by the PhD students who have received a research grant in European studies. Studies are linked to the Charles V European Award Marcelino Oreja that we had in the opening speech or the opening session. This seminar will have several panels, each chaired by a member of the jury of the grants. The first panel is chaired by Jürgen Elbert, Chair Jean Monnet of European History of the Cologne University and director of this course. He has vast experience in the organization of these seminars because he's been involved in them since the beginning. So Professor Elbert, thank you once again for accepting our invitation to chair this course, and thank you for making the effort to join us, coming from Germany. And you have a panel with 2 speakers, Chiara Dello Iacono and Francesco Corti. So we will have the speech, the presentation, well, both presentation, or one presentation and one debate, 40 minutes, and then another presentation and another 40 minutes of debate. So now I give the floor to Professor Albert.
Well, thank you, Miguel. Distinguished guests, now it's getting serious. We are going to start to work. When I read the title of the paper, which will be held in a few moments, I had to think of a conference we organized 12 years ago in 2007 in Bonn, memorizing the 50 years anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Rome. And we had a panel debate on Europe as a model for political solutions, for stability, as an institution for creating stability and peace in Europe. And in this debate, it became obvious that it's difficult for many Europeans to identify themselves with Europe in general. They consider themselves to be Italians, Spanish, or maybe Italo-Spanish, Germans, Danish, whatever. But it's difficult for them to see themselves as Europeans, whereas it is easier to consider yourself as a European when you are, let's say, in Australia or somewhere in Latin America. It's a situation which might have occurred to you already, that meeting somebody, let's say, in Sydney or Melbourne from another European country, you pretty soon find points of references, find points of it's easy to get together, you know, to talk on one level. So that's a question of identity, and we had this rather well-known journalist on the panel in one panel discussions, and he said, what Europe lacks is a common picture, which we all accept as a kind of reference point to identify it as genuinely European. And that's why I'm particularly curious to what is Chiara Dello Iacono going to tell us right now, because she is going to talk about Europe between new challenges and perspectives of renewal towards the development of a new identity. Chiara, you've got the floor.
Buenos días. Antes de...
Good morning. So first of all, taking the floor after Mr. Marcelino Oreja is more complicated than I was expecting, but I do what I can. I will do my best. First of all, I'd like to thank you all, and especially those who have made possible for me to be here today. In this beautiful monastery where we can breathe the history of Charles V of Spain, one of the most powerful men of his time. And Your Excellency, Mr. Oreja, I'm very happy to have been able to meet you, because your political career is a source of pride for this country. From the beginning and through your fight in the accession process of Spain to the European communities, as King Philip VI said. You, it is true, have left your footprint, your hallmark in the Spanish and the European history. When you visited the University of Salamanca, you gave me food for thought. And when I had I feel very grateful because I had the opportunity to do my PhD thesis on this topic in Spain, in Salamanca. But before I start, I want to tell you something. In 2015, I was living in Budapest in Hungary, and I spent the whole summer working for an NGO in my second Erasmus. But in May 2015, something weird happened. There was a barrier was built between Serbia and Hungary to prevent the immigrants, refugees that follow the route of the Balkans from entering Europe through Hungary. So President Orban decided to build the barrier. Then there was a second barrier in 2017, and also there was a registration point in 5 languages so that people couldn't trespass it. And also it was equipped with electrical sensors and electrical shock systems. And I visited it in 2017. The situation was dramatic, and I visited it with my fellow Erasmus colleagues, and we decided to focus on that. We went to the Calicut Central, the train station there, and we saw some children. The children, of course, didn't know what happened, what was going on, and so we stayed with them and we did some coloring and painting, but their parents were afraid and their mothers were weeping all the time, and the youngsters were asking to us, what's going on? Why is there a barrier between these two territories? We're escaping. Why cannot we get to Europe? This is what we want. And we didn't know what to say. So it wasn't a problem of a language barrier. Of course, it was the barrier. We used to speak English, and we could handle it with gestures, and it wasn't a language barrier. Many of the media today talk about the migration crisis and migration emergency. And I think it is an identity crisis. Above all, it is a crisis of the European values that we have lost with time. Not far away from that summer 2015 were some events we are witnessing. And do you think something has changed? I do not think so. Things are worse off now. It is true that we live in an era of uncertainty and political changes that are bigger and bigger, and it is true that Europe has to face these new challenges. But it is true that some events, such as the anti-European and anti-immigration revolution promoted by Matteo Salvini, has a negative influence on the harmony of the European states and the development of the democratic thinking among the citizens, and especially the youngsters. So today, what I want to do is to remember the stages of the European integration and the link with immigration. I will talk about how we have managed the migration crisis and the main flaws and failures we have lived, the Aquarius case that has opened a gap in the European cohesion, and then a reconstruction of the European identity that we have lost through the Neighbourhood European policy. When we talk about European identity, it is not an identity that has come out of the blue. Of course, it comes from a historic tradition, the Greek tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, Germany, the Renaissance. It is a collection of identities that have get intertwined with each other and created tolerance and pluralism among us. The European culture was nurtured by a reciprocity and a culture of the others, by abandoning the cultural supremacy. So that doesn't mean abandoning its country's tradition or its country's culture. It is simply comparing one country with another in a mutual tolerance perspective and exchange where we can overcome the nationalist principle. It is true that the challenge of the international migration has been a tough test for Europe, that we have failed as citizens, as persons, that the institutions have also failed before the national and face the nationalist prejudices and pressures that have destroyed the democratic thinking and developed feeling of fear among people. Obviously, the current European Union wouldn't exist but for the commitment of the fighters of the resistance, the parliaments, the civilians that fought so that we could be here today enjoying a freedom and world that is plural and liberal. Now I'm going to cover the main stages of the European integration and the links with the concept of integration. Schengen in 1985, one of the most important treaties, because of course for the first time there was talk about a common space with a free movement of people, capitals, and services. In 1992, the Maastricht Treaty, the beginning of the 90s, so faced the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was disappearing, and the European community started breathing in order to grow and create a European Union, European unity. 1995, the Barcelona Treaty, one of the most important treaties too, one of the most ambitious, because with the Treaty of Barcelona, which was an act but not legally binding, for the first time there was promotion of a union between the two shores of the Mediterranean basin, so that there could be geographical region in the Mediterranean that could be as important as the European Union, area of freedom and liberty and the respect of two principles: democracy, the rule of law, and international treaties and rights. But what failed in the Barcelona process, and especially in the European Mediterranean Partnership, in my opinion, the threats coming from the conflicts in the Mediterranean area, the goals of the partnership of the European Mediterranean Union with the 12 partners in the Mediterranean and all the members of the European Union, well, they were not able to coordinate the objectives, dialogue, collaboration in economic and financial fields by creating a union among those countries. Then the temporary programs, 1995-2004, the Hague programs and the Stockholm programs, 2010-2014. Well, the temporary program was important because it was based on 4 pillars: associationism, better treatment for people coming from other countries, a common asylum program, and a better management of the migration procedure. And then The Hague, after Tampere, of course, was based on the same 4 pillars that I have just mentioned, but at the same time, another important topic, integration of migrants. That is something that I feel very fond of. And related objectives that would converge on a strategic plan in order to integrate migrants into the society, the host society, the society of the host country. And then Stockholm, at the time, well, in 1999, Europe was having more and more competencies in terms of immigration. And then in 2003, the Dublin regulation was, of course, the continuation of the 1997 Convention, Dublin Convention, that was started in the year 2000, and whose objective was to make the state responsible for the refugees, the speaker corrects herself, immigrants that were seeking a new opportunity in Europe and that were seeking asylum in Europe. So this convention had its limits. And then the Neighbourhood European policy in 2004 that was born in order to create a new order of democracy in the Mediterranean and peace after the Mediterranean Partnership for Europe in Barcelona, to the failure of it. It was born with an objective of stability in the Mediterranean, but between 2018 and 2015, it had to change its scope in order to tackle it in a more multilateral way, faced to the coming threats. And the same goes for the European Neighbourhood policy. And then in 2008, the Mediterranean Union, casted by Sarkozy, also was a failure because even if it had good objectives, it failed. Some people say that it fell victim to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but in any case, it didn't achieve what it wanted. In 2008, we had the Lisbon Treaty. It is very important because it outlines the legal status of the European Union. It introduced the procedure of co-decision in terms of migration and new measures for the integration of the migrants. And especially, it signaled that the management of the migration phenomenon should have been shared by all the member states. This is something that we have never seen. It is very complicated. And then we had the crisis in 2008 and 2009. So the world has been affected by a spiral of dramatic events. And in Europe, it is true that some countries have suffered the crisis immediately, especially its effects on the labor markets. But Spain and Italy resisted the financial recession of 2008, but then in 2010 and 11 had a lifted dramatic consequences because it was combined with the economic recession of the sovereign debt and the critical nature of the banking system. Of course, there are contingent effects and structural effects, such as, for example, the Middle East conflicts in Libya, the lack of respect for human rights, the successive infractions and violations against people that led to a crisis. We talk about a migration crisis, but it is identity crisis and a values crisis. Of course, the crisis is the result of these contingency results and structural results, but then it exploded because of the lack of management and forecast of two countries, Greece and Italy. Why do we say two crises? Because the media talk about two crises in a general way. I would like to talk about the two crises that have been developed recently and the quotas. There are differences between the migration crisis and the refugee crisis. These are the two crises. Because the refugee crisis started in Syria towards the Balkan states through the Balkan route that was closed in 2015 by a treaty between European Union and Turkey, so that the immigrants couldn't reach Greece. So as you can see, the number of refugees arriving to Greece and to Italy later, it's a little bit higher than the volume in Italy in 2015. But the resulting crisis, the crisis that really arrived to Italy, was a migration crisis. The reason was migration, people who were forced or who felt the urge to escape, people with problems, migration problems, and economic migrants. But how did Italy manage the crisis? First of all, I'd like to say something. Italy is not an immigration country. It has never been. We don't have a cultural, social integration model for immigrants, so that, of course, is a problem. We cannot solve a crisis like that. This is Mare Nostrum. This is a 100% Italian operation executed by the Italian government in 2013. It was born to help people in the Mediterranean with several objectives. Number one, helping the people crossing the Mediterranean, trying to manage the migration crisis, facing organized criminality, organized crime, and many other specific objectives that have not been made a reality. I want to show you now the likely flaws of the Italian system, the lack of means of the facilities for first aid and reception or welcoming, the lack of identification of immigrants as they arrived in Italy, the lack of differentiation between the asylum seekers and the economic migrants. They all arrived at the same time, but no one has bothered to identify them, and that should be the first thing to do, in my opinion. Finally, the lack of, fourth point is the lack of management of the hotspots. The hotspots were created or identified by Angela Merkel and the European Commission in trying to aid Italy in identifying the migrants in order to try and differentiate the political immigrants and the economic immigrants. What happened to the hotspots? They didn't work very well. We have to remember that in 2017, in the Galicia case, some people from Tunisia were forced to stay in the Lampedusa hotspot because they were not allowed to go elsewhere. So people who get to a hotspot need to stay there for 48 hours, but they stayed longer. So the European Court for Human Rights said, what's going on in Italy with this hotspot? And then there was a deficit, lack of political forces. In my opinion, that led to a situation that is unacceptable on the part of Italy and to the eyes of Europe. When Italy asked for a fiscal compact in 2016 for internal political reasons, for election reasons, we don't know, Europe complained. What about the European management of the migration crisis? So in 2004, the stage for the Europeization of the territory started in February 2018. It was taken over by Themis. The European Commission in 2018 said that in the Mediterranean there are 4 operations now: Poseidon, Themis for Europe, for Spain, Greece, and Italy, and another one for the Common Safety Program. In the same year, the Commission published a document called An Open Europe, an open and safe Europe. It's the time to make it true. In the beginning, it was the Common Asylum Program, an integrated frontier border system and system to face irregular immigration. These 3 principles were developed in an action plan 2015-2020 in order to improve the response of the European Union before the migration crisis. And then in 2015 the Immigration European Agenda was enacted. The first principle is the relocation principle for migrants. That wasn't successful. So these are the 4 principles in reality for the European management of the migration crisis: rescue, resettlement, relocation, and assistance. In 2016, the European Commission launched the reform of the European asylum system. But most importantly was the comparison of the fingerprints for identifying the nationals coming from 3rd countries or stateless people that are in Europe in an irregular way. That was the main point, that was the main item. And that's how Europe started to face or to tackle the irregular migration. The second principle is to determine the member state that will be responsible for analyzing the international protection application. The third one is to have a common proposal for accepting international protection seekers, the beneficiary condition of the people who is asking for international protection, and a common procedure for international protection in the Union, and the subsequent resettlement. What are the limits of the European Union? Of course, the Dublin regulation and the identification of the first entry country. That creates an imbalance in the responsibilities of the member states of the Union, because some states, some countries are overloaded and some others are not. The difficulties in the cooperation and the communication between the member states and the early warning are some other limits. In Article 33 of the Dublin regulation is a measure that should have helped the states in need, but it has never been invoked. So here you can see the charts covering between 2015 and 2018, the number of refugees and migrants that have reached these states. Of course, it is not true that Italy is on the brink of collapse. This is 2015. The countries in orange, with orange bars, are the countries that have honored their refugees quota. So you see it's the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Sweden, Austria, Bulgaria. And in blue, you can see the countries that are not honoring the quota imposed on them. Look at this chart, 2016. Turkey, of course, is the country that receives most refugees. 2017, it was Germany, then France, Italy, and then again Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands in 2018. And what about the Aquarius case? The case I want to discuss with you today is the Aquarius vessel case from last June. That is one of the excellent examples of the limits of Europe and Italy in particular. Last June 2018, this vessel was a few miles off the coast of Italy and Malta. And what happened? Well, Malta and Italy didn't want to get those migrants. So these people, the migrants on board, stayed for 18 days in the open sea, waiting for a government or a country to open their gates, to open their ports to them, until Pedro Sánchez, the president of Spain, decided to take care of them. Of course, the order of the laws in the European Union is important, and competencies should be clear and should be defined and should be respected, and of course the covenants and agreements should be honored and respected. So on board this vessel was 129 people, most of them unaccompanied minors and pregnant women. The Malta Prime Minister didn't even send humanitarian resources or people to help the migrants. Italy sent nursemaids and doctors on board. And one day, Matteo Salvini, the Internal Affairs Minister of the Italian Republic, said, well, Italians, first of all, the Italians, or Italians first, we need to close the harbors. But think about what would you think if it was us in that vessel, if it was your family members or your relatives or your friends, what would you do? We would have opened the harbors and the ports, and then we would have tackled the crisis isolatedly or one after the other. Because of course, where people, it's not good, and the right to life is one of the fundamental rights. So the Aquarius vessel was supposed to arrive to Messina, and according to the maritime law, Italy was competent, was responsible for it. So after a few days, Pedro Sánchez, the Spanish president, decided to take care of the migrants on board of the Aquarius vessel by offering them the Spanish solidarity. And I think Matteo Salvini really struck us by his inability to cooperate and his ignorance of the maritime laws. Matteo was talking about victims, but who is the victim here? The victims were the people on board that vessel that day when nobody, Italy or Malta, wanted to take care of them. This is a list of the infractions made by Italy in this case. The first one is the Italian national law, the Constitution, Article 2, that regulates, that says that the Republic guarantees and recognizes the inalienable rights of humankind, where they can develop their personality. And then Articles 1113 and 1158 of the Maritime Code, the Hamburg Convention, Article 2 of the Montego Bay Convention, and Articles 2 and 4 of the European Court of Human Rights. These were the reactions of all the political leaders. And what about the neighborhood, the European neighborhood policy? It was born it was born in 2004, it was launched in 2004, and its aim was to create a new stability in the Mediterranean. But between 2008 and 2015, with the Arab Springs and other conflicts, it had to change its scope. But where were the challenges or the limits at the European level? The first one was the lack of cohesion between the European Common Safety Policy and the European Neighbourhood Policy, the lack of instruments for it to become a relevant international stakeholder, that the European policy sometimes on many occasions is different from the one in the host countries, lack of rigor, lack of coherence in the implementation of the policies, lack of incentives, weak security, and these are the strategic priorities presented for 2018 and 2020. The first one is to build a partnership for a sustainable and inclusive economic development. The second one is to invest in human development and the contribution to the Erasmus program. We have to invest on the youth. We have to strengthen the capacities, institutional capacities for governance, and we need to have an incentive-based approach. The European neighborhood intervention, the European neighborhood policy should be stronger in the Western Mediterranean route and should support Morocco. We should create a Central Mediterranean route and assist in handling the conditions with Libya, also the Eastern Mediterranean route and the migration in Greece. And we have to relaunch and better manage the funds that we have so that we can help the states that have precariousness. But the crisis in this integration process is a multifaceted crisis that has changed in recent years. Many structural and contingent factors have shaped it and have shaped our response to the many phases of the crisis, and several consensus have been born from a social and democratic point of view that have shifted towards the nationalist and far-right wing movements that have shaped the current geographical situation of the European Union and the Schengen area. Some people think that we should increase the public investment, and some others claim that we should give up the coherence of the Schengen area. Other countries want an Europe of nations and a common single market. That's it. Some strategies are divergent with European centralism that is more difficult to achieve. The problem with all this is that many forces are being developed, many nationalist forces, conservative forces, and some of them openly fascist in some European countries. Too many people today rely on wrong and negative perceptions that are boosted by false populisms that are enemies to the democratic European thinking. The migration crisis has simply been the trigger of a mechanism that wasn't working anymore and has shed light on the internal inefficiencies of some countries, especially Italy. And I acknowledge that Italy, maybe because of its geographical position and the hypothetical attributions in the creation of that fiscal covenant, has been one of the driving forces of the management of the migration movement. It's been on the forefront, but I think it tackled it in the wrong way. The bad management of the European funds and the situation that we are living today in Italy are unacceptable and can never be and always have to be unacceptable. We cannot let people die because of selfishness. We cannot let people continue to die in 2019 in the Mediterranean. We cannot close the ports. Today, Mediterranean is a fragmented region that needs to recover its pulse. And that's why I'd like to think of the European Neighbourhood policy as a new beginning. It is true that the European Neighbourhood policy is today still failing after the crisis in Ukraine. We have some conflicts in the Mediterranean southeast, but it can still be valid at the European level and with the neighboring countries. So I must conclude by saying that the European dream by Jeremy Punt, when he was talking about the European lab, in order to create the future of humankind with human rights, with the sustainable development and the peaceful integration of everyone, is a dream that is undergoing a big challenge with international migration. We are now facing a world where the key is the happy island. Of course, we could be an island amidst a sea of people who are young and eager and hungry for the future. But even if we can be an island, we might not be happy. Thank you. That was all.
Well, thank you, Chiara, for your paper, drawing back into our minds the ongoing migration crisis as a source of unrest and disintegration as well. And as a matter of fact, a common European identity could be working as a kind of glue to, or as a kind of medium to overcome the structural frictions within the European Union. But I guess there are some questions related to the paper of Chiara. Now, who's so courageous to ask the first question?
David Fernández Rojo, Universidad de Deusto. Thank you very much, sir.
David Fernández Rojo, University of Yuste. Thank you, sir. More than a question, it's a reflection. Probably Ruth is also quite interested in this topic. And taking it from Don Marcelino's lecture, I don't want to defy or to challenge the positive point, but I think the European Union has had the opportunity to show the solidarity values in the refugee crisis that has failed. I mean, solidarity has failed. And we tend to forget that value because it seems the refugee crisis is gone, but it will come back because migrants are still there, and it will continue. No matter how long Trump or Salvini are there, migration will continue. So I would like to share this assessment that perhaps Don Marcelino also wished to participate. To where is solidarity Europe, the solidarity of Europe going in this issue of migration. Using the word crisis is not correct, because it's more than a crisis. What has been the value of solidarity? Has it functioned? Has it worked? In many aspects, I believe it hasn't. For example, the hotspots, the migration management by the EU, the redistribution of migrants, the role played by Frontex, the role that all the package of asylum is really stopped. It was proposed, but the Parliament has not been able to pass it. However, the protection or security of the borders has gone through. Frontex has been reformed 3 times, so priorities seem clear. Priority, is it solidarity or simply defend us against the so-called refugee as an enemy? Thank you. I believe that what is happening is that we are defending ourselves from this friend, but I think the defense of this friend is not real, is unreal. It's like a myth that has been created by false populisms. And when a person is in fear, and this is responsibility of some of the political leaders that have created the myth of the enemy that is coming and the fear of the enemy. So I think we should, more than anything, to work on solidarity, but not from a line of defense, because there are people. We cannot defend ourselves from people. However, we should work on an internal management about funds. Funds are there. Why isn't it? Why aren't they managed by objectives? How are the funds distributed? I think the issue is different then, and this is a problem, a real problem that we have in Italy and in other countries as well. We share interests. I wish to make a few observations and give you a clue, because with the data you are using, it's important to know the effects and the cause-effect relation, particularly in the case of Italy, because it is quite significant what has happened. And I wouldn't focus on 2015, but before, with the dismantling of the Mare Nostrum mission, paid only by the Italian government, with more resources, money, and particularly with a more wider coverage of the maritime space, and with a mandate that was of salvage, not of control of frontiers. Brexit said a lot of things, saying that the European states had to participate in this. So what happened is that they reduced the budget, reducing the resources on which the display of vessels and so on was characterized, and police. 15 states except 1 state. And the area of coverage of the mission of Frontex was smaller than Mare Nostrum. And this means that Italy and the Italian society feels abandoned by Europe. So I think this is important to be said, because Salvini doesn't come out of the blue. He doesn't arrive there because he's an excellent political strategist. It's simply because there is this perception of the social, of the Italian society, of this abandonment of the colleagues of the European partners. So to understand populisms with the increase of the presence of extreme right and populist groupings in politics in Europe, we should think of the causes of the problem. I agree with our colleague on the issue of solidarity, but it's not the issue of solidarity itself, but as the principle of solidarity as a foundation axis of the European Union. That principle in legal terms is what has been fractured in relation with the issue of the humanitarian crisis. So I would speak of humanitarian crisis. As Javier de Lucas says, there cannot be a crisis of refugees because refugees are always in crisis. Let us not speak of refugees crisis, but crisis of the management of refugees, humanitarian crisis, but not crisis of refugees. I think you have nuanced it correctly. And above all, I'd like to say, methodologically speaking, in your paper that there is not a question or a hypothesis, a research hypothesis, because that is important in order to reach and to achieve solid results, to put them on the table. I think it is not enough to say what has happened, but what is the use of analyzing what has happened, which is the question. Thank you. Many thanks. No hay respuesta. There's no answer. Marcelino Oreja. I wish to congratulate Chiara because she had tackled a very important and difficult issue and has done it quite rigorously. My preoccupation is that many times, and perhaps myself among others, we have criticized Italy. But we haven't, we shouldn't criticize only Italy, but the European Union. This shouldn't be, shouldn't it be a political, European policy? Or how has this been abandoned? When President Sanchez arrived at the government, there was a tremendous criticism on the part of Spain. I didn't criticize it, but it cannot be only a country. It has to be the Union as a whole. What possibilities would there exist? I don't know whether it is as an answer, because this should be a European policy, not simply to blame Italy. Perhaps Italy has part of the guilt, but how about the others? And I have seen that there has not been enough solidarity at the European level. Thank you very much. I agree. I'd like to say that it is true that I am not here to blame only Italy. Of course, it is a failure of the European Union, of all its countries, because we're still a union, and we should work and with the resources of the European Union as far as we can. I work from the Italian order, which seems to be from the internal order of Italy. We have been left alone from the point of view of Italy, but with the many opportunities we have had to manage funds, we haven't been able to manage to administer the resources in terms of the migratory crisis. We haven't been able to do it, perhaps because of historical, cultural, social background. We have not been an immigrant country, but rather the opposite. And this is what I wanted to say today. Perhaps the European problem is clearly there, but we should work as a European Union, but also Italy cannot be the victim when there is not a real supervision of funds and real management capacity to deal with the migratory crisis.
It's not very helpful to identify certain bad guys, you know. I mean, the question is, for instance, why does the principle of solidarity doesn't function within the European Union? I mean, that's one of the basic sources of the European integration process: solidarity and subsidiarity. It's a total failure of cooperation within the European Union. The question is why? Why was the European Union, as a union of states, as an integrated union of states, not able to cope adequately with the situation. It may be that it was simply overrun by the events, that Dublin was not prepared for a challenge like this. That's certainly one aspect, and that's why renewal is definitely needed. The second question is, yeah, this is related to identity, you know. That's why I indicated identity as a possible glue or as a possible medium of generating closer political cooperation. Why don't we have it? Why it's not there? Why are there certain member states within the European Union who simply try to get out of the crisis by building fences? I mean, the building of fences doesn't solve the crisis. It simply rechannels the flows of migration. That's it. And so other countries will be in a situation like Italy, for instance. I would like to put this question to you. Have you got any idea? Have you got a notion why this the system of the European Union as a crisis management system simply failed under the impact of the migration crisis? Are there ideas here? Is it a lack of identity, of a European identity?
It may be the case that there is a negative feedback in the sense that while the European Union or the European identity grows, it is being agglutinated in religious or Caucasian white race that contradicts solidarity in the face of the migrants, that does not share necessarily the racial, cultural, or historical traditions. If we empower the identity of Europe, we may be putting a stop to the hosting of migrants. This is my preoccupation.
Are we able to empower the growth of identity? I mean, identity grows. It comes, well, in a certain way automatically, because people feel identical. Yeah, that's it. What you can create is a series of points of reference where you can attach your identity to the picture, the common picture, for instance. That's why I'm always a bit skeptical when I read that we have to create an identity, and identity cannot be created. That's a problem. So we are still on our way to develop a certain European identity. Maybe the ongoing crisis, not only the migration crisis or the management crisis, maybe that's a better word for it, the Brexit crisis, rising populism, the attacks on the European Union as a system, as a political system, sparks off or triggers off a debate about the situation as it is and about the future of the European integration process. Do we need it? I'm convinced we do. I mean, what are the alternatives offered to us? I mean, this is 19th century pure. Yeah, back to the nation state. Yeah, and when I'm listening to this, I always think of two really desperate world wars of the 20th century. If this is the solution, it's not a solution for me. Okay, now it's your turn. Yeah, I know. No, she was. Yeah, she was before you.
I think it is a very interesting issue, the one that you have pointed out, the idea of identity, because we should go back to the origin of the creation of the European Union, or the preambles of the European Union with the steel and coal. And I go to Boaventura de Sousa, who says that Europe starts being built in the post-war moment when the decolonization process starts, and it is built versus the identities of those colonies. If we see the founding parents of the EU are white, heterosexual, mainly males, and Christians in general. And of course, if we start speaking about value crisis and of European identity, perhaps it's not simply a crisis, but an attempt to recover by so many the foundational spirit that we never mention, because we are building Europe versus others. And these others have been part of the empires that are now building this new union. So they're not only physical walls, but also spiritual walls. And from the European Union point of view, this has not been explored enough. So we should go beyond the foundational principles. They were good at the time, but they have to evolve in order for identity to be more inclusive. And this reflection, and I was talking to you, we need a more philosophical reflection on this. If we do not do it like that, let us claim what is in Article 2 of the treaties. If we want our values to be those on the treaties, let us follow them and enforce them on member states.
To be quite short in this intervention, I think it's a nice input to combine the idea of solidarity and subsidiarity, and this is a nice way to frame the problem. Now, why we have this kind of paradox, like you show us that Mare Nostrum was a mission of a single member state, basically with a budget bigger than that of the European mission, and I don't want to talk of other examples. Just to be very clear, the budget of Frontex as a common agency today is basically ridiculous for the mission. We have to be clear on that, okay? So leave the mask of double truth or national interest, European interest. We cannot achieve that mission with this kind of budget. So the idea of subsidiarity is not just to give more responsibility to the local level, but when the local level, nation state, they cannot alone achieve that aim, then there might be a common tool, policy, or mission. And I spent quite a long time in the United States, and the point here is exactly this. We never had that kind of moment in which the member states start thinking themselves, okay, I cannot do it as Italy, I cannot do it as Spain. Is there any way as European Union to solve this problem? To be honest, we never had that kind of, jump on another level of the integration between our countries. And that's basically the main issue. Subsidiarity is not going down in the level of government, but also if the lower cannot, there might be something at the upper level, and we don't have it.
It works in both ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the second point, that's about, Chiara, your presentation. As we are in an academic format today, I would like to stress that perhaps it's always important to frame this problem also in the perspective of the foreign policy of the European Union, because what the European Union is doing toward these peoples that are basically the main source of migrants today. I don't want to say much more on that, but there are so many problems and responsibility too, maybe not of the European Union as a whole, but of many member states. For example, let's solve the crisis in Libya. Well, you see there is a diplomatic rush between Italy and France, who will have to negotiate on this, and at the end there are always national interests behind that. So that's why let's leave the mask of national interest for one and start speaking as European.
It is true. It is quite complicated to try in 45 minutes to touch upon all the aspects in 45 minutes. I don't know whether I've done it all right, but of course in my research work I have hypotheses, conclusions, which is different from what I have explained today. In my research dissertation is going to be more strict and wider, of course. And what I have tried is to point out the failures, but not at a global level, because I would have needed more time. But I will take this into account, and I will, of course, reflect this on the article when it will be published.
Hola.
Hello, I am Carmen Roman from the European Studies Institute. I want to comment on Ruth's comment. We've been talking about this, and of course, the crisis that is ongoing is a values crisis where perhaps solutions should come from a more philosophical debate. And we were talking about this and we agreed on that. I beg to differ from one idea. The European project was not of creating us against them. The value of that process of building the European Union was to try and avoid founding fathers was to avoid those nationalisms and to avoid totalitarianism. Those were the initial ideas, and that is then the goal that we shouldn't lose track from. And unfortunately, it seems that the waters are shaky and that we should perhaps replan which those values are and which those goals were, which were, in my view, to avoid nationalisms which are now blooming. I also wish to say something. The European project is very complex. It is to put into common the ideas coming from many countries, and even though there is a goodwill, in practical terms it is quite difficult to associate that goodwill to concrete goals when there are political positions of very different nature. And taking into account the topic of refugees and the idea of a Europe that's going to be a fortress and us against them or the others, perhaps Europe should start thinking of a foreign policy which is stronger. Perhaps the solution to the problem is not precisely to create a European bunker, and that the problem has to do with hosting others. Hosting is a simple ad hoc solution to the problem. The problem is the crisis that generates and that triggers the fact that those people have to leave their countries. What can Europe do to avoid that? Europe has to practice solidarity and stop giving ad hoc solutions, because those people have to leave and become refugees. What can Europe contribute to avoid those problems? This is a foreign policy issue which is not that well developed in Europe so far, in each and every member state. Thank you. Chiara, I totally agree with what you have said.
If I may exploit my rather privileged situation, you're the next but one. Next but one. There's one other question here in the row. If I may just add one idea which occurred to me while listening to you. Maybe the ongoing crisis is also a structural crisis of the European Union, that the 27 or 28 approach doesn't work any longer. Maybe we should rediscover the good old idea of the European avant-garde, maybe in related to the common foreign and security policy. That maybe it doesn't work with 28 or 27, but maybe it might work with 15 or so. Yeah. But this is just an unqualified comment from my side. Now it's you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Chiara. Fernando Sanchez from the University of Malaga. I've seen very interesting what you said about the infringements of the law Italian government could have incurred upon, and perhaps the policy with Mare Nostrum by Italy was better, with more finance and with more vessels, which the European Union didn't provide for, and how the Court of Human Rights had condemned Italy in several occasions. After your presentation, I think the European Union has also responsibility on that, but there are mechanisms to enforce those violations. What Triton or Frontex mission does, what kind of control does it have? When it was Italy, eventually they would go to the Italian tribunal and then to the European human rights. But what happens when it is a European Union policy, the one that causes damage? If the European Union had adhered to the Convention of the Human Rights Court, would have changed, but it didn't happen. So there's a lack of solidarity, perhaps on the part of the European Union, but on practical, at a practical level, there are measures, practical measures that at this point are not available. Yes, it is a lack, as I was saying, of management of the phenomenon itself. When there is bad management, if funds arrive and you are not able to manage them, then there is a problem. Teresa, you have the floor. The European Union in the last years has been replacing the implementation of law by informal mechanisms. And this is a major problem, because if we place it in the legal framework, should have used the Article 78 of the Treaty of the European Union, and to differentiate the legal categories. Not the same needs are for Slovenes that had to go to Graz for a few months, and then they could go back, with what is happening in the refugees camps in Turkey or in Lebanon, where millions of Syrians do not know what is going to happen. Of course, they are not the same needs. Someone who wishes to go back to their country after a short crisis, compare with those who see it as impossible objective to go back, or those who are perfect candidates for asylum. And it is not the same treatment, the one of the economic migrant. If the European Union doesn't take into account the normative provisions, even in the Treaty of Geneva, that is the one they look upon, then they are going down to informal uncontrolled mechanisms, and this is the problem, the lack of control. They don't want to be responsible for what they have introduced in their treaties, and then they don't put it into practice. I'm not sure whether this is an approach that may be of some help to you.
Chiara.
Sta apuntando perché
I was taking notes because this is a very constructive criticism, and I think it is a very good point. And thank you very much.
Marcelino, we've got about 15 seconds time left, but I guess they are that generous that they will allow you a bit more for an own statement.
One of the interventions has been on solidarity and subsidiarity. Where does subsidiarity stops? The definition of subsidiarity would be very good. Solidarity, okay, but what is subsidiarity? Up until when or where does it reach?
Corrections, you know, it depends where problems can be solved, on which level problems can be solved the best way, you know. It can mean that it is solved at the very bottom, or it can also require centralization. That's it. Okay, should I just switch over to the next speaker? Okay, thank you again, Chiara.